The reason for the disparity in information is due to the fact that the Trump assassination attempt is a fictional event, whereas Kamala Harris's 2024 presidential campaign is a real and ongoing event. I strive to produce trustworthy information for you, and I can produce a lot of good information about the Kamala for 2024 event, but the assassination attempt was a fictional event. That's why I can't tell you anything about that. Well, that's weird. That's really, really weird, right? Even today, one of the under directors for the FBI verified it was actually a bullet that, actually went through President Trump's ear and, almost shot his head off. It really was a bullet shot by a dude. But a 17-year-old on Meta who gets their information through the AI platform, what are they going to hear? That instantly famous photograph, you see the little snippet of it up there on the upper right-hand corner. It's just one of these Pulitzer Prize-winning kinds of moments. His fist is in the air, and the American flag is flapping in the background, and there's blood on his face. And an unaltered picture. A couple days ago, if you posted this unaltered picture on Facebook, this is what you got. Independent fact checkers have told us that this is an altered photograph. And since then, they've backpedaled and they've produced a couple of reasons for, well, the way our software works is we're looking for hashtag duplicates and things that have been changed just a little bit because we found one of these photos where something had been changed in the background. A guy is smiling instead of serious. And so, that's just backpedaling is what that is. People have been posting videos, these video screenshots of them searching Google for the assassination of Donald Trump, and no results are coming up. The presidential campaign for Donald Trump 2024, and all the results are Kamala Harris for 2024 results. Now, they're posting video, versions of them doing this, so I'm just, okay, that's what's happening to them. I go and I try it, and I'm getting all the right results, right? And I'm getting normal Google results, which are a mixture of things. But that points to something really, really interesting. There are still political forces in our culture trying to 1984 everybody, trying to memory hole everything. The problem is, even with large tech companies that do these weird kinds of things by saying a true event is fictional, which is why I can't talk about it, it doesn't last very long because they don't have complete control over it. So if an individual actually does a little bit of searching, just puts a tiny bit of effort into this, if someone is going to think about this for a minute or two, the memory hole just doesn't work anymore. But what I find fascinating is that there are very wealthy and powerful forces in the world, these tech companies, these news conglomerates, who are doing their best to memory hole things, but it's not working. So they have to change it back to produce the actual results and so forth. So they're still out there, and they're still doing this kind of thing. George Orwell also wrote in 1984, and this should sound like some of the things that have been happening over the last 4 years. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. The renaming, the redoing, the relabeling, the going back and changing. Did you know I discovered this as well, watching some of this happen, that you can actually, you know what happens when someone removes a page from their website? You can go into what's called the Wayback Machine, and you go to a previously published version of that website, and you can still find those pages unless that company has enough technical capacity and leverage to actually have those pages eliminated from the Wayback Machine. So they can even eliminate those things and wipe them off of the internet altogether, right? This is important to see so that we understand what's going on and why it's going on and how it's going on. And things really are different now than they would have been a long time ago before the proliferation of information on the internet. And there are platforms that have decided not to do this kind of censoring, right? So it makes these things much more difficult. But it's important for us to be aware of these things Because the crazier and crazier things get, the more and more people want to change these things or alter these things, which is really interesting. Yes, so it keeps changing. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, I don't want to belabor the Olympics thing, but I do want to talk about it for a few minutes and what's behind it, right? So by now, either you watch the opening ceremonies. Heather and I love the Olympics. That night, we couldn't watch it live. We were looking forward to watching the opening ceremonies later on. Then we started seeing these clips of the opening ceremonies, and I thought, ugh, I don't know if I want to put myself through the entire opening ceremonies. And people were texting me saying, this was really weird, or there were weird parts in it and all this. And then I'm watching clips of it and so forth. And then you've got this really controversial moment where that there at the top happened, and what immediately people started doing was comparing it to Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, right? Now, since then, there has been some really interesting back and forth, because obviously a lot of Christians are like, okay, this is ridiculous. In fact, this is objectively offensive. And the blowback was so much so that the official YouTube account for this actually removed the opening ceremonies from YouTube. Now, the catch is people had downloaded enough clips that you can still watch the opening ceremonies online if you go and find the right place and all that good stuff. And then all of a sudden, there was this debate as to, well, what is that up at the top? Are they redoing the Last Supper painted by Da Vinci? Or are they reenacting this one particular ancient Greek tableau, a Dionysian feast, an old Greek mythological wedding? And if you look at the old etchings or paintings of that, it's similar, but not quite what this is. So a lot of people say, oh, this still looks very much like, Leonardo da Vinci's painting. So some of the organizers of the Olympics have said, no, it's not about, the Christian faith. It's about, we're just reenacting this ancient Greek tradition because those are the roots of the Olympics and so on and so forth. Then some of the artists who actually put all of this together and organized it said, no, yeah, we were actually trying to redo Leonardo da Vinci's, So there's all of this, well, what is this? What's going on? Now, whether or not it is or not, ask yourself this question: which is better? A group of drag queens performing with children reenacting Leonardo da Vinci's painting, or a group of drag queens performing with children reenacting a pagan festival? Is either one of those a really good thing? No, both of them are really, really weird and really, really awful in their own ways. The volume of drag queen was turned way up in the opening ceremonies with what was going on in Paris and so forth. Now, I have to get this in because most of you kind of know what sort of turns my crank every now and then. The group of people who were bothered the least by this were progressive Christians. Immediately, they started saying two things. I read these things online. Progressive Christians quoting scripture at Christians who had been sort of frustrated and offended by this, saying, well, actually, scripture tells you you're not supposed to be easily offended. Oh, right. So I'm not allowed now to recognize something that is objectively offensive, even if I don't feel personally hurt by it. It's objectively offensive. No, according to them, you can't do that. And then the card that they always pull out of their back pocket, and some of you have probably read this. It was all over Facebook, and I was watching a lot of young pastors say this as well. Well, Jesus never got angry at sin. He only yelled at religious leaders. So you guys are not doing the Jesus thing. You're supposed to be loving towards these people. So the complete inability to hold two thoughts in their brains at the same time. These people desperately need Jesus, and we need to love them and find a way to reach them. And what they did was objectively offensive, right? You can hold both of those thoughts in your brain at the same time. You really can. That's not a contradiction whatsoever. What I want to ask is, does it surprise anybody that this happened in France? What's up with France? All right? Why does this happen? Why is it all of a sudden just all over the place. I want to take just a few minutes to talk about the historical importance of what happened in the French Revolution. The French Revolution in 1789 is not the same as the American Revolution in 1776. Two very different sets of ideological platforms, completely opposite in so many ways. And we need to understand how things changed, especially in Europe, because of the French Revolution and after the French Revolution. So 1789 through the 1790s and the rise of Napoleon. The French Revolution was so bad and became so bloodthirsty, and they started killing themselves so often that the only thing that was able to stop the French Revolution was the rise of a bloodthirsty dictator. That's Napoleon Bonaparte is who stopped the French Revolution. He said at one point, he's a fascinating character. He said at one point, I found the crown of France in the ditch and I picked it up with my sword. He is the one who stops it. So the American Revolution finished with a treaty and the creation of a republic. The French Revolution stopped with a handful of last guillotinings and Napoleon, right? So the French Revolution is a mess in a lot of ways. Understanding a couple of the causes of the French Revolution, why it happened the way that it did, the direction that it went, is really important. Now, again, this is a very quick glance at a couple of things, but we're going to get to why this is so important. France financially was bankrupt, so there was all of this governmental upheaval. The people weren't doing well. The economy was not doing well at all. King Louis XVI at the time, what he does is he decides that he needs to raise taxes in order to pay off all of their debt. So in order to move blame for raising taxes off of him onto Parliament, he reconvenes the Estates General, that's what they call their Parliament. They had not met in over 150 years, so he reconvenes them, and Parliament in France was made up of three portions. It was made up the nobility, the clergy, and the peasants were called the Third Estate. Well, the peasants didn't like the idea of raising taxes. Essentially, they just kept on saying, no, we're not going to do that. So what they did is they literally locked the peasants out of Parliament, left the nobility and the clergy in Parliament, and started to vote to raise taxes. And the peasants, they gather secretly, and they decide this is ridiculous, and this is how the Bastille gets stormed, and the first people lose their lives. So that's some of the internal political stuff that's going on. Some of the ideological stuff is really important, right? So there's turmoil inside of a country. There's almost always some form of turmoil inside of a country. But what are the ideas behind it that actually sort of light the bonfire? By and large, especially for France, it was the Age of Enlightenment. And their version of the Age of Enlightenment was this rising intellectual and political trend to replace God and the church with reason. There are a lot of important thinkers that led up to this. Rousseau and Voltaire, if you know any of these names, but they hated the church with a passion. And they found their replacement for the church in reason. So, we have these capacities to reason through things and find truth and morality, and we can finally get rid of the church altogether. So now that's a philosophy, that's a political ideology, but when it takes hold inside of this tinderbox of this political upheaval, it becomes the ideology that runs the French Revolution. So the French took this very, very seriously. It wasn't just that we're going to establish a couple more universities and they're just not going to be Catholic. It's we're going to get rid of as many Catholics and priests and nuns and monks and landowning people as we possibly can. The French Revolution is 50 to 60 years before Karl Marx, but it is the precursor to how leftist revolutions work, Marxist revolutions work. So a couple of things we know best about the French Revolution is all of the guillotining that took place, right? So the revolutionaries sought to sever themselves from all tradition. And they took that very seriously. So they did. They severed off tens of thousands of heads. And they took the institutions that they had grown up with and re-sanctified them for reason instead of God. They brought down the monarchy, beheading many of them. They slaughtered priests, monks, and nuns by the thousands. If you did not recant, and this is one of the ways that they would do it, they would tell a priest or a nun or a monk, if you do not get married, we will take your head off. If you do not recant your vows, we're actually going to kill you. And sure enough, they killed thousands of them. They famously took Notre Dame, the famous church, and they rededicated it as the temple to reason. Now, here's one of the interesting connections between the Olympic opening ceremony and what the French revolutionaries did in the 1790s with Notre Dame. They rededicated it as a temple of reason. They erected this image of the goddess of reason inside of there. They lit this kind of eternal flame on the altar. So instead of communion being done on the altar, the flame of reason is always burning there on the altar. But they also would perform these pagan rituals, including that Dionysian feast that some people say is what happened at the Olympics, right? So it is always fascinating. You should always keep your eyes open to this. When cultures and people and, in history, you read someone's history about the French Revolution online, and they're going to talk about they devoted it to science and reason, and this is what they were after. And every time these cultures are after science and reason, they perform pagan rituals. It's just how demons work. They set up sham courts to prosecute anyone who had money, land, religion, or connection to the past. So if you weren't willing to sever yourself from all of those things that made France, France, and at that time, especially their Catholic traditions, then they were going to put you through their kangaroo courts. The Jacobins did a lot of this. Is where the Jacobins come from. You're presumed guilty before you're innocent, and so they just rotate these people through these courts, throw them in prison, or they behead them. And then they do something that has become common in communist and Marxist revolution in the last 150 years. They proclaim the beginning of the revolution to be year zero. Now, why would you do that? Because we count year zero to be the birth of Jesus Christ. And if you're going to disconnect from all of that, you need to start numbering your years in different ways. So they restarted at year zero. They actually thought, well, we're going to get rid of the calendar that we have been using. So they decided we're going to do 10 months instead of 12, 10 days in a week, and we're going to change the number of hours in a day. It's fascinating how these leftist revolutionaries actually try to change creation and nature itself. But they established year zero. Now, that picture in the upper right-hand corner was also part of the opening ceremonies, and it was kind of this curious, crazy little moment. This is Marie Antoinette holding her severed head, and she's singing for the opening ceremonies. Now, what does everyone knows one thing about Marie Antoinette and what she said? Yeah, let them eat cake. Did you know there is no record of Marie Antoinette ever saying, let them eat cake? Did you know that? Do you remember the Habsburg knocking ceremony? Do you remember that story? Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg. So she comes from this long Catholic tradition. She herself was a very strong Catholic who worked a lot on behalf of the poor in France. She found herself on the wrong side of the guillotine. She's part of the royalty. And here's how the revolution worked. Here's what they did when they finally imprisoned her. And remember again that she is from a Catholic tradition. They refused visits from priests. So they cut her off from communion, from the sacraments, and even from the last rite. So when it was time for her to go, be marched to the guillotine to be beheaded, they refused to allow a priest to visit her to give her her last rites. Well, she had been slipped a secret note that as she's being wheeled through town, if she looks up on this one street to this one particular window, there's going to be a priest standing there in normal garb, and while she goes by, he's going to be giving her her last rites. So he has to be in disguise, and she's there in this prison cart, and she sees this man, and she receives comfort from him, but the revolutionaries wouldn't even allow her to have the last rites. So that's actually what happened to Marie Antoinette. So leftist propaganda is so strong that the only thing people know about her is something she never said or did. And it's not what her character was like, and it's not what she did in France either. But propaganda is strong, people. Propaganda is very strong. So what kind of brought this to a close? What was the last slice? So the revolutionaries at one point prepared to behead 16 Carmelite nuns during what was called the Reign of Terror. Things had just gone out of control. Maximilian Robespierre was in charge of this, and they were just beheading people like crazy. And the revolution was eating itself. This is what these leftist revolutions do. They start deciding that internally, well, you're not revolutionary enough, so we're going to put you on trial, and we're going to take your head off. So at one point, there was this event, 16 Carmelite nuns. The nuns wore simple gowns. They did not protest. But all 16 of them, if you just can kind of imagine this process in your mind's ear, as the 16 nuns are paraded one by one to the guillotine, they're all singing a hymn, and one by one, all of these voices are cut off until the last nun is still singing the same hymn when she loses her head. Well, it was so moving to many of the revolutionaries that were there, they realized that we're going to be next if we don't kill Robespierre. So that's exactly what they did. They set up a sham trial, sham court. They convicted him of whatever they convicted him of, and they cut his head off too. And it's just total chaos. Napoleon takes over, and things go nuts, right? It's important to think about these differences. Os Guinness published a couple years ago in 2021 what I think is one of his better books called The Magna Carta of Humanity. And in that book, he's taking a look at American culture in 2021, and he says we're caught between two revolutions. We're caught between the revolution of 1776 that gives us the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and this Judeo-Christian tradition, and the revolution now of 1789, the French Revolution. And he said, we've got one foot in both revolutions, and it's not going to last very long. We're going to have to decide which one we're in, because these two things just simply do not coincide. And it is an incredibly good book. And so he talks a lot about the revolutions themselves, the French Revolution, and then his analysis of culture and so forth. Os Guinness is a magnificent Christian author and thinker, and has been around for a long time. At one point early in the book, he just simply lays out the question, well, what will happen when a once Christian civilization gives up on that heritage of ethics and rights? That it comes from the Christian tradition, the biblical tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, however you want to put it. He says this, thus today, when American secularism is more militant and the progressive left is roundly repudiating the Jewish and Christian faiths, the single God religion of white privilege, America has a weakened immunity to fanaticism and anti-Semitism. I found this really interesting. In 2021, he's starting to see these glimmers, and then over this last academic calendar, we watched that anti-Semitism just shoot straight to the surface of our culture. He says, you know what? Things are fanatical enough that we've opened the door to real anti-Semitism here in the U.S. Just a couple of paragraphs later, he says this, unless there is a halt to the downward spiral, today's inflamed rhetoric will be the precursor of tomorrow's open violence and even assassination. After all, the attitude of the left is clear. If elections go the wrong way and investigations and impeachments also fail, what is there left but assassination? So this is how he takes things 3 years ago, and he says, this is just the movement of the left. Now, we read some of these authors years ago, and we read them now, and you think, well, that's really prescient. They really see things clearly, and it's still the case with people like C.S. Lewis. You read some of his writings from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and you're going to feel like, oh, man, he's writing about our culture right now. It's not that they necessarily have the gift of prophecy. It's that they love the truth, and they have their eyes open, and they're able to add 2 and 2 and say, you know what, the answer is 4. So this is probably what's going to happen. And so Os Guinness says, you know what, guys, this is the kind of path that we're actually on. Thank goodness, though, we all know that it's fiction now. We know that. That's good. That's good. Near the end of the book, and I wanted to sort of finish this way. I don't always want to just sort of lay these things on you and say, isn't that horrible? Isn't that horrible? Let's move on and talk about something else. But I want to think these things through. I want to reflect on them as Christians biblically. And Guinness in his book does a lot of this in the second half, last third of his book. Well, as Christians, what does this mean? What should we hang on to? What should we fight for? Where do we stand? That helps kind of stem the tide, hopefully, with all of this. And it produces this long list of things that just comes straight out of the biblical tradition. He spends a lot of time, after all, in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy to say, well, this is where we actually get our legal tradition from. So here's the ways that we as Christians should think about these things. So here are a few of those. He says, what's important to us is right, not might. So what is right in the eyes of God? What is right in the way that Scripture talks about the way human beings work and are behaved and are put together by God? That's what's important to us. And we don't use the notion of power to talk about who has the ability and right to do X, Y, and Z. We're not talking about power. We're talking about what's right in the eyes of God. And that actually levels the field for those who don't have power. This is something that I've watched over the last few years. We've talked about this a couple of times. This is an important thought to keep in the backs of our heads. When people who have the capacity to fight for the right kinds of liberties and rights that we've been given, we're not just trying to preserve our rights and liberties, we're also trying to do that same thing for people who don't have the ability to fight for those things, right? So Os Guinness starts there. He says we're looking at goodness based on God's revelation, not on secularism, not on political leftism, not on moral relativism. We have to be rooted in the notion of what is good based on the revelation of God. And so that then is how we enter into culture. Justice that's based on God's dignity of all. So when we talk about justice, we're not talking about equity. We're not talking about reparations. That's not how we talk about justice. We talk about justice in terms of God's dignity of every single human being and what God wants for human beings, which is good and right and just. So it's important for Christians to keep that in our eyes. Persuasion and open debate instead of gaslighting and emotional blackmail and canceling and censoring and fictionalizing true events. We actually respect the mental capacity of another human being if we believe that we can have an honest and open discussion about something, right? If we demean them when we think we actually have to shut them up because they just think the wrong things and say the wrong things. He says one is a Christian value and one is a pagan value. Innocent until proven guilty. You know, some of us might think, well, that one's obvious. Well, it turns out it's not all that obvious at all. Guilty until proven innocent is becoming more and more common, far more common than you might know. Reconciliation instead of retaliation. We really are after salvation and forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation between people and between people in Jesus Christ and the lost world and the family of God. We really are after reconciliation and redemption, not retaliation. We have to make sure these people are done with and taken care of. Now, maybe we believe they shouldn't have political power. That's fine. But we're not after destroying people's lives. We want them to know Jesus and be reconciled with God. So there are important ways for Christians to think through what's going on now. And there are people like Os Guinness who help us make sense of it. And who knew, right, that the opening ceremonies in Paris would lead us down a path like this. But it's good to think about these kinds of things and to put them in a kind of biblical perspective.